Hello everyone, and bear with me if you're watching the replay. Today, Spirit asked me to share with you a story. So, Spirit asked me to share a story with you today. And it does have to do with Jesus, but before anybody gets all freaked out, let me tell you that you're going to want to hear this. Whether you grew up Wiccan, whether you grew up whatever, I'm not converting anybody to Christianity here. I want you to know the story because it has a very important spiritual lesson. It has a very important spiritual lesson that whether you're religious or whether you're spiritual, it has a very important spiritual lesson that anybody who has spiritual gifts has to go through. Okay, so that's why Spirit asked me to share it today on this Saturday. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to get on. On this holy Saturday. And I want to start the story off by saying this. So my entire life, I've grown up with Jesus in my household. Okay. So the story of Jesus is not new to me. It's not like I became a spiritual person and I never read the Bible and I never read or I never studied Jesus in my life. I was always had Jesus Christ in my life, right? But here's where my unique perspective comes from. I grew up in a household where my grandfather was a spiritist. He was a caballo de misterios. He worked with the orishas. He worked with the mysteries. He worked with some of the Egyptian beings. He worked with the indigenous beings, the Arawakan beings, because he had many spirit guides. So I grew up in a household where I had my grandfather, who you guys know is very dear to my heart and is my spiritual mentor. And so I grew up in a household where I had my grandfather, who was a caballo de misterios, meaning he was a spirit vessel like myself. And he also was a medium. So I wouldn't call him a medium. He was a spiritist, meaning he worked with beings that were elevated, higher spirit guides that were elevated. He always, however, also believed in Jesus because he understood Jesus's spiritual perspective. And because my grandmother was a Spaniard, she was, I think, only a second generation Dominican. Her parents actually migrated from Spain to Dominican Republic. So, to my knowledge, I might be incorrect on the generation, but I believe she was only a second generation Dominican, meaning that she had her grandparents had just migrated from Spain to Dominican Republic not that long ago. And if you guys know anything about Spain was a very Catholic country, very Catholic, very, very, very Catholic, which meant that my grandmother was ingrained with Catholicism her entire life. So she knew Catholicism like that. Like my grandmother, you can ask my grandmother any rite of Catholicism, how it's supposed to be performed, and she will tell you. Okay? It gets annoying sometimes, but anyway. So I say that to say this, like I'm speaking from experience when it comes to Jesus. This was in my life, right? So I did all of the Catholic rites before I became initiated in the 21 divisions. I did all of the Catholic stuff. I was initiated. I was baptized in the Catholic Church. I went to Sunday school. I studied the Bible. I did all of the things that a good Catholic does. I grew up with Catholic guilt, meaning everything is my fault. Mi culpa, mi grandísima culpa, right? So I grew up both with the Catholic teachings on one side and the teachings of the spirits on the other side. My grandfather was first a horse for Elijah, what we know as the Barón de Cementerio in my tradition. And then he became a horse for other Gede spirits. Okay? And then my mother was a horse, not for Anaïsa Pie, the African version, the African spirit, but she was a horse for Saint Anne, who is the Catholic saint, Jesus' grandmother. Okay? Now, let's start with the story of Jesus, because a lot of people who didn't grow up Catholic don't know the story of Jesus. So I'm going to share the story of Jesus as I know it, as I remember it, growing up, watching or reading the story every single year. Every single year. And those of you who don't know about the 21 divisions, it is a mixture of Catholicism, indigenous, and African practices, because most people who practice it have that mixture in them because they come from a very small place in the Caribbean where all of those things mixed during the slave trade, during migrations, during whatever. Not everybody was mixed because of the slave trade. A lot of people were mixed because of migration. For example, my grandmother's family migrated from Spain. My grandfather's family was brought to the island because of slavery. Okay, so and then my grandparents met, and even though it was against the rules because they were of he was a man of color and my grandmother was a whiter, lighter skinned woman, they married. And even though my grandmother was shunned for marrying him, she didn't care. She did it anyway. So anyway, long story short, I say all that so that you guys understand the context of where I'm coming from. So this is the story that I know of Jesus growing up, listening to his story every single year of my life. During those times when Jesus was born, the king or the emperor heard that there would be a man that would come and that would take away all his power, that would overthrow his kingdom. Okay, he heard there was a boy that was being born. Very, very Harry Potter-ish, right? There would be a boy that would be born and that would overthrow his kingdom. So he set out to kill every boy that was born in that time. And he set out to kill them and to eliminate his competition. So at this time, Mary had just gotten pregnant miraculously. Now, it wasn't uncommon back then for a woman, a maiden, to get pregnant by a god. Okay, because if you remember the story of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, who happened to have a very similar story to Jesus, if you know the story of Greek god Zeus, you know that his wife Hera, the queen of the gods, of the Greek gods, was always mad at him because he was always going around having sex with human maidens and getting them pregnant and then leaving all of these demigods on the earth, right? Like Hercules. So, it wasn't uncommon in those times for a young maiden to have sex with a god and end up, or maybe not, she didn't even know, because Zeus used to trick a lot of maidens into not even knowing how they got pregnant. They were getting pregnant by him. So if you read the story of Zeus from the Greek pantheon, you know that Zeus was always sleeping around and Hera was always mad at him. Okay, to the point where Hera even contemplated with the other gods killing Zeus, because Zeus just kept being, a womanizer, sleeping with all the human women. So anyway, back to Jesus. So it wasn't uncommon for a maiden to get pregnant by a god back then, right? So we have the story of Mary. Mary was conceived through a miracle because Saint Anne, Mary's mother, couldn't have children. And she was very old, actually, when she became pregnant. And she promised God that if he gave her a child, that she would, that she would dedicate this child to him. So that's why when you look at the statues of Saint Anne, you see her always teaching the Torah to to Mary, okay? Because she promised, she was a Jew. She promised she was going to dedicate her daughter to God. So she did. So she studied. Also, some stories of Saint Anne tell us that she was an herbalist, that she was a curandera. So she used to know how to she used to practice Jewish mysticism, okay? Where she would pray over herbs and teach people, okay? So it's not uncommon, right? So at this time, we have the story of Jesus. So Mary gets pregnant miraculously, which is not uncommon in the time because, like I said before, the god Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, used to get maidens pregnant all the time. So it was common for gods to impregnate young maidens that didn't know any better. So at this point, Mary had been promised to Joseph, right? And Joseph becomes very angry when he finds out that Mary is pregnant. Very angry, very, very angry. But an archangel comes to Joseph and says, don't worry, it was God that impregnated Mary. We need you to take care of her. And Joseph, being the good, the good servant to God, he took Mary and he married her, and he's taking care of her as her pregnancy proceeds. And all of a sudden they start to hear rumors that the emperor is killing all the firstborn children, or killing all the boys that could compete with him, because the prophecy said something along the lines that a child would be born to the nation of Israel that would overthrow the emperor, or something like that. So he's going around killing all these children. So Mary and Joseph end up having to get a camel and fleeing to Egypt, to my understanding. So they had to flee. So they flee, then you get the story of the little manger, of how Jesus was born in a manger because the hotels of the time didn't have room for them. So he ended up having to, one of the hostel owners was kind enough to let them stay in the stable in the back. And that's why Jesus was born in a manger, right? So from a very young age, there are stories talking about how Jesus had like all of these spiritual magical abilities. Like he was able to pray over people, and he was able to heal them, and he was able to do all these magical things, right? These miracles, right? So like if you look up the miracles of Jesus Christ, you'll see this list of miracles, right? When he was older. Now, to my understanding, when Jesus was a child, nobody really liked him that much. A lot of people did not like him, which is very common for spiritual people, right? So people who are born with spiritual gifts, it's very common that people will not like you. And when he was younger, that was no different for Jesus. He questioned, when he went to temple, he questioned the rabbis. He questioned men who were ages older than him. Like, why is this like this? Why is this like this? This is not the way that God really wants this to be. So he would question them. They would get very upset with him, very, very upset with him. And they would, and he was just like, this isn't right. This isn't right. This isn't right. Now, there are some, according to my Hebrew teacher, she told me that, I'm not sure if this is true completely, but I'm telling you what she told me. According to my Hebrew teacher, she told me that in order for Jesus to be able to teach, he had to be married, because you couldn't teach in the temple unless you were a married man. And to my knowledge, Jesus, when he got older, he started to teach, or he started to do some reading, right, in the temple. And he would question the rabbis, and the rabbis always kind of give him a side eye, like, why are you so the way you are? And he's like, because I just don't believe that this is the way that it should be, right? So anyway, so Jesus grows up, and then he decides somehow along the line, he hears, or he gets a calling from God to go out into the desert. So he goes out into the desert for, I think it was like 40 days or something like that. Supposedly that's the reason why we have 40 days of Lent, right? Because Jesus went into the desert for 40 days and he fasted, and he didn't consume food, and he was tempted by the devil, and he was tested, right? And then he had this spiritual awakening in the desert, and he comes back from the spiritual awakening, and he's healing people and he's uplifting people, and he's these people that had been put aside, the lepers, right, that had this like skin condition on them, they had been pushed aside because they were seen as unclean, right? The poor, all these people that were set aside. Yes. So Jesus came through. Okay, he drank the dew from the rose of Jericho. Yes. So he all these people that came through and that were put aside, he started to embrace them, and he started to preach to them, and he started to talk to them, and he was called a blasphemer, and he was told by the Jewish rabbis that he was going to go to hell because he was not doing, he was a blasphemer, and he was not accepted as the Christ, right, by the Jews. He was not accepted. Because there was a prophecy as well in the Jewish prophecy, like that there would be a man that would take over the kingdom of Israel and overthrow that emperor, right? So remember that prophecy? Okay, so the rabbis were waiting for that man, okay? But they didn't believe that it was Jesus. They didn't believe that it was Jeshua. They were like, no, because the child of God would follow the rules that we have, right? No, they would never expect the child of God to be like, no, you're wrong. Like, this is actually the truth. So, which ends up happening to a lot of us spiritual people, right? Who try to say the way you've been doing things is not actually the way God wants things done, right? Or if a spiritual person comes in and channels a new message from spirit that is like different than what other people expect, then, all of a sudden, they don't have a gift, right? Or their gift is questioned. So it was really interesting because then we have the trials. He goes through these trials and tribulations, and he gets to a point where he's doing all of this, all of this healing. He's doing all of this preaching. And for the while, they leave him alone. But then eventually the rabbis start to get angry. Okay, so he goes, he overthrows these bank tables in the temple. He flips them over because he doesn't like that they're doing like the trading of money inside the temple. He becomes very angry and flips over the tables, and he questions the blood sacrifice, and he questions like all these things, right? Okay, and so because Jesus is being Jeshua is being so rebellious to the Jewish faith, right? Then he kind of is seen as like this rebel, and they're like, we have to put him down. We have to put him down. He's becoming a problem. So the rabbis go to the emperor, and they're like, yo, he's becoming a problem. Like, I need you guys to deal with him. Like, we need you guys to deal with him because Jesus is becoming an issue. Like, he's overthrowing tables in the temple. He's questioning blood sacrifice. He's doing all these things that were not cool, because that's part of our religion. That's part of the religion. That's how the religion has been since Moses took us out of Egypt and whatever, and blah, blah, blah. So I need y'all, he goes to the temple, he goes to the general, he goes to the emperor, he goes to the general, the main rabbi goes to them. And it's like, we need you guys to deal with Jesus because we have the celebrations coming. And if he's talking about all this stuff, he's going to start turning all the Jewish people, and he's going to start having people question the religion and question our authority and all these things, right? So the rabbis start to attack Jeshua. So it comes to a point where at this point, as the rabbis are speaking against Jesus to the emperor, you need to put him down now because he is messing with our religion. Jeshua is gaining momentum. He's gaining followers. He's gaining people who have intuition, people who realize, wow, yes, it's true. To a point where one of the people was Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was a priestess of Isis. She was actually a priestess of the Egyptian deities. And she was called a prostitute by the Jews because she honored multiple gods. Okay, so anyone who was polytheistic, meaning you had more than one god, you were considered a whore by the Jews. Okay, so you would be called a whore. You would be called you're prostituting yourselves to all the gods, right? So she meets Jesus, and her intuition is so strong. She says, yes, oh my God, yes, this man has a gift from God. This man is part God. He is a demigod. So she becomes very, very dedicated to Jesus, and she follows him around. She becomes one of his main apostles, okay? He baptizes her and purges her of all her sins and whatever it is, and he does a spiritual cleanse on her too, because at the time, Mary Magdalene had also been afflicted with some demonic forces that had started to attack her. So, he does like a cleansing on her, and he does all these things. So then she becomes an apostle for him. And then, slowly he starts to gain the 12 apostles, the other apostles, Peter, and so on and so forth. Peter and Mary Magdalene have kind of like a bit of because Peter doesn't like how Jeshua really likes Mary Magdalene. Probably a little too much. Anyway, so back to the rabbi. So Jesus is gaining momentum. So this is again the evil eye, right? The evil eye. They're jealous that Jesus is getting this attention. They're afraid that he's going to destroy their religion. So they start to try to find any way they can to oppress him, to shut him up. And then now this is the story. You can read it in the Bible, right? Now, if you believe in the Bible. So at this point, then we get to, Jesus is starting to be celebrated. Then we get to Palm Sunday, right? So Palm Sunday. And on Palm Sunday, Jesus is being celebrated by the people for, his work, for doing all these miracles and all these things. And how you have the proceedings and all that stuff. And within a few days of Palm Sunday, the Jews who started to follow him turn against him. So you see, this is the story of being a spiritual person. Like, this is the story of being a spiritual healer. You don't always, it's not new. The people who you serve, oftentimes, because they want to be part of what's popular, will turn against you often. Okay, so when it's no longer popular and it's like, oh no, like we don't want to get in trouble, so we're just gonna turn, right? So within a few days, like within 4 days, Jesus goes from being praised and being raised up. Jeshua goes from being praised and being raised up to being arrested, right? And not only was he arrested, but he was betrayed by one of his own apostles, right? The people who said, oh, I'm going to be your initiate. I'm going to follow you anywhere you go. I'm going to follow, and I'm going to teach your teachings to the people, right? So not only was he betrayed by just a random follower, right? He was betrayed by one of his initiates, right? So Judas sold him for a few coins. All right. He sold him out for a few coins. So that's like right there, like that's the story right there of, many people. Many of us have had that one person, right? We've had that one friend, that one family member that we never thought would sell us out, and they sell us out for a few coins. Right? So that's a spiritual lesson right there within itself, right? So then he's betrayed by Judas, and for a few coins, and he is arrested, and he is denied, right? So many people deny even knowing him. They're like, I got nothing to do with him. The only one who's trying to save him is Mary Magdalene. She's begging everybody. She's trying to like find a way. Like Mary Magdalene is so dedicated to Jeshua. She's just like, she's the only one who's trying to actually save him. She goes and she tells Mary what's going on, and Mary comes, and Mary calls some of her nephews, I believe, and tries to get her nephews to save Jeshua, to get him out, and then the emperor, 30 silver coins. Okay. So, but Jesus knew that all of this was going to happen, because Spirit always tells us when we're going to be betrayed. Spirit always tells us, hey, this is part of your lesson. This is a lesson. So this is a lesson. This is part of your spiritual elevation, right? So, Jeshua's there. He knows what's going to happen to him. Mary Magdalene and Mary are obviously, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother, and his cousins were trying to figure out a way to save him and get him out of there. And then the general gives the Jewish people a choice. You can either let this thief go, or you can let your rabbi, your teacher go. Okay? So they vote, and they chose to save the thief. Okay? So then Jesus goes, and Jeshua goes, and Jeshua gets crucified. Right? So then you have the very, 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 very well-known phrase of a very well-known phrase by a Catholic, right? Jesus was crucified, died, buried, descended into hell. Okay, on the third day he raised from the dead, and then he became seated at the right hand of the Father as a God. Right. So you have that very popular quote that many Catholics have to kind of know by heart. I know for a fact that Jesus is sat at the right hand of the Father, but he's also seating next to the left hand of the Mother, because I've had the dream after my grandfather died. I had the dream of his judgment, and in his judgment there was a God, there was a goddess, and there was Jesus, and then his orishas and his angels and all his indigenous spirits were there to speak on behalf of my grandfather in my dream. Now, if anyone knows anything about indigenous culture, we believe that any dream that we have, if we can remember it like very, very, very crisp, not nightmares, but dreams, they are often psychic visions, or they're often, and Spirit had promised me that they would allow me to see his judgment, my grandfather's judgment. So I know for a fact that Jesus is real. Okay. Now, I don't subscribe to the fact that Jesus doesn't want us to believe in our other spirit guides, that Jesus doesn't want us to work with God directly. Because there's a story, and you can look it up. There's a story of how God wanted to be close to the people, but they were all afraid of him. So that is the reason why Moses had to be the one to walk up to Mount Sinai and get all of the rules from God, because his people were too scared of him to go near him. Okay. So that is actually what ended up causing there to have to be priests and priestesses, because the priests and the priestesses would be a in-between between the humans and the gods, because people were too afraid of the gods' powers. They were too afraid. So usually it would be like the most brave that would become a priest or priestess and be the one to actually speak to gods on behalf of the people. And that's one of the reasons why Moses was the one who went up there and got the 10 Commandments, and then they built that little box that sits in the middle of Israel, because that's considered like where God's light comes down to earth and speaks to the people, right? But only the rabbis can speak, and then they deliver the message out to the people. So I wanted to share the story with you, not from a religious perspective, but from a spiritual perspective. And then you understand that every one of these stories has a purpose. It has a spiritual lesson, right? So Jesus' spiritual lesson was the story of overcoming obstacles over and over and over and over again, right? So you have the tarot that is filled with, right? So this is overcoming obstacles over and over and over and over again, right? You have the tarot that is actually filled with Catholic symbolism. And then you have the story of betrayal, which is in the tarot too. Right? So let me see if I can find the card. So you have the story of gift, of being given this beautiful gift, and then being betrayed and being tested by the devil, and having to go into the desert by yourself and be a hermit, and receive the messages from God yourself, because there's the hermit receiving that enlightenment, right? So Jesus walked through the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, and he received the enlightenment from God. And then you have the betrayal of Judas, right? There's little Judas. And you have all of these things. It's like, and there is, once Jesus actually rises to heaven. And so we have all of these stories for a reason, because they're teaching us, they're trying to teach us something about human nature. Okay? They're trying to teach us something about human nature, about when humans tend to see something special, they either gravitate towards it, or because they're in such a low vibration, they go in the very opposite direction of that person or thing that is so high vibrational, that is trying to motivate you to be better, motivate you to connect to God directly. Okay. I thought it was really interesting that Jeshua's story was so similar to Zeus's. If you know the story of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, his father had heard a prophecy that said that one of his children would overthrow him and consume his power. So Zeus's father, every time that Zeus's mother would have a baby, Zeus's father would come and he would devour the baby. He would eat the baby, right? And eventually, by the time Zeus was born, the goddess was like, no, you're not eating my baby. Like, I'm not letting you do this anymore. And she hid Zeus as a baby. She hid him away, and she wrapped a rock in Zeus's blanket, and she presented it to Zeus's father, and Zeus's father just ate it. Okay, but the rock somehow had this magical ability, and it ended up like killing him in one story. In another story, Zeus grows up, comes back, kills his father, frees all his siblings from his father's stomach, because gods are immortal, and even though they had been consumed and eaten by Chaos, Zeus's father, they still were residing in the loins. And when Zeus came and killed his father, he released all of the other gods that his father had eaten. So it's really interesting that the story of Zeus starts so similar to the story of Jesus. And it's a spiritual story of transformation. It's a story of going from, right, the fool, the fool that is just loving and has no fears, and is just going out there trying to share his knowledge and his love and his healing, and then transitions into all of these, the magician and the high priestess and and then you have the struggle between the high priestess, the magician, and the emperor. And then you have like the Hierophant involved, right? The Hierophant is the the Hierophant being the rabbis, right? And then you have the lovers, that lover that tries to save him, Mary Magdalene, who tries to save him, right? Who is Jeshua's soulmate, or twin flame, you could say. And even if they didn't have a intimate relationship, they were very close to each other. And then you go through all these tribulations where you're lifted up on this chariot, and then all of a sudden it's the tower falls, right? The tower falls before your feet. If you know anything about the tarot, the major arcana is literally the story of Jesus. It's literally the story of every single god that has ever been born. Every single god that we have ever really had a story about, right? You go to Egypt and you have the son Ra, who has these children, but he has to fight he has to fight chaos every day and every night, right? So his children are the ones ruling the earth. So you have Osiris and Isis and Set and big Horus, because there are actually some stories talk about how there is an older Horus. So you have all of those, you have them, right? And then Set comes, and Set was not the bad guy to begin with, right? Just like Lucifer was not the bad guy to begin with. Lucifer was originally, just who he is, right? So, and then you have Set, who's like, I'm tired of living down there in the desert while Osiris and Isis get to live in the Garden of Eden, okay? They get to live up there in the nice part of Egypt, and I have to live in the desert, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to become the king of Egypt. So what? So he kills his brother. He dismembers him into many pieces. Well, the first time he killed him, he just tricked him into a coffin. The second time he killed him, he dismembered him into many pieces, threw him in the Nile, and then Isis had to figure out how she was going to collect all the pieces of his body and put him back together. And then she tricked the god Ra into giving her his name, and then by knowing his name, she was able to bring Osiris back from the dead, but his man part was missing, so she had to make a fake phallus to become impregnated with Horus. Okay, so then she had Horus through magic, and then Horus became the sun god, right? So then you have all of these stories. And then if you look at the Ifa pantheon, you have very similar stories too, when it comes to Chango and his wife, Oba. And then you have similar stories. A lot of people don't even know that his wife Oba existed. Oba was Chango's first wife. And then he fell in love with Oshun. And he also was married to Oja, who was his warrior wife. So there is a lot of, you have even in the Norse pantheon, you have Loki and Thor who are fighting for power, right? Thor was born to actually take over the throne. Loki is kind of like that little sly trickster guy. I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say they consider him the devil, but Loki is a trickster. He tricks his entire family into somehow sending Thor away and him becoming king. So you have all of these stories of these gods fighting with each other, and the struggle between good and evil, right? And you even have when the Garden of Eden, when in the Garden of Eden, when Eve and Adam were thrown out, you have them having children, having them Cain and Abel, but then Cain wants all the power, so he kills Abel. And that's where all the story comes, that all of us have a little bit of Cain in us, and that's why we have evil in us, is because Cain wanted to have power and have all of it for himself, so he killed his brother. So it's all a very interesting spiritual story of transformation, of overcoming obstacles, and every single person on their path to spiritual elevation has to overcome obstacles in some way, shape, or form. Now, we have to remember that there are some people that are on a lower step of spiritual elevation than we may be at. So you may have the frustration of having to explain to someone whose soul is not meant to elevate as much as yours, that what you're doing isn't wrong, that you are literally doing what Jeshua did. He was questioning the established religion. He was questioning the status quo. And you have your parents, maybe you have your parents or you have your friends questioning you, like, why are you doing this spiritual stuff? Why are you honoring your spirit guides? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? But you have to realize that that's the same thing Jeshua did. Jeshua honored God his way. He prayed to God his way. He had conversations with God himself. So you have all of these, and then you have, the Christian religions that turned around and distorted Jesus's story to try to fit their agenda. So you have to realize that in every single religion, there is some sort of, there are some teachings that are valuable, but You have to kind of know how to discern the line between the teachings that are valuable and the teachings that are there to try to control your connection to God. So that's all that I have for you guys today. I hope that this story of transformation helps you. And I'm gonna go now because it's Holy Saturday. I wasn't even supposed to be on, but Spirit told me to come on and tell this story. So I hope you have a blessed day and have a beautiful, beautiful day. Many blessings.